So in this part, we're gonna replace the Docker Hub with AWS ECR. So we are already deploying to EKS cluster on AWS. And instead of pushing our images to Docker Hub and then fetching them from Docker Hub onto EC2 instances in our Kubernetes cluster, we're actually going to use the ECR, Amazon's container registry, as our Docker container registry. So here's a list of things that we need to do in order to replace this part of building the image and pushing it to the Docker registry of AWS ECR instead of the Docker Hub. First of all, we need to create the registry. So we're going to create the ECR repository where our images are going to be hosted. The difference here is that with ECR, we actually have unlimited number or almost unlimited number of private repositories, whereas in Docker Hub, we just have one. And that means that we can actually create a repository per application. Once we have the repository, we're going to need credentials for that ECR container registry in Jenkins. So just like we created the Docker Hub repository credentials in Jenkins, we're going to create credentials for ECR. And then we're going to use them right here. The process is actually pretty similar. We're building and tagging the image with the repository. Obviously, the ECR repository name is going to be different than this one right here. Then we're going to do Docker login, just like here with credentials of ECR. And then we're going to push to that registry. So that part is very similar. We're going to see how to do that. And once the container or the new Docker image is actually on ECR, we need that image to be fetched and started on EKS cluster, right? So it means that Kubernetes need to fetch that image from the ECR repository. And for that, we're going to create a secret for our ECR repository, just like we did for Docker Hub. So we're going to create a Docker registry type of secret so that Kubernetes can fetch the image from the ECR. And once we have all of these things set, we can actually go and change our Jenkins file as a final step. So with that said, let's get started. First of all, I'm gonna go to AWS Management Console, and I'm gonna go to ECR, Elastic Container Registry. Right now it's empty because I don't have any repository, so we're gonna create one. We're gonna create a private repository and we're gonna give it a name of the application. So let's call it Java Maven application, Java Maven app. And this is, as you see, a repository name, very similar to what we get in Docker Hub. And this is your AWS account ID. And this full thing or combination of this both is going to be the full repository name. And with the default settings, we're going to create our repository. So basically how this works is very straightforward. We have a repository for each application. So for example, if you had microservices application, you would actually have own repository for each microservice. And then each microservice will have new versions or version tags, and those tags will then be all listed in the respective repository. So in our case, we have Java Maven app repository, so all the different versions and the build name, whatever, these tags will actually end up here. So we have the repository. The second step would be to create credentials for our ECR repository in Jenkins. And the way we can actually get the credentials is very simple. Actually, we have this cheat sheet for each repository. And if you look at that, you have all the commands with the actual values already filled out to use them. So the first one is actually the Docker login command. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to create a username and password credential in Jenkins for this ECR Docker repository. So let's look at this command right here. First of all, we have AWS ECR. So you know that AWS command line has sub commands for each service, right? So this is ECR service. So AWS ECR has its own commands. And one of these commands happens to be get login password. And with this command, if I execute it locally, so on my laptop, on my host, if I execute this command locally, because I have AWS user already configured on my laptop, and we can also provide the region, my region, but this is also the default, so no need for that. And if I execute this, I'm going to actually get the password of my ECR repository. This is going to be the password in our ECR credentials. And if I go back here again, so this is the first command, as you see, this gives us the password of the ECR registry. And the second command here is docker login, right? You know that docker login takes the username and password credentials, and the username, as you see here, is AWS. So we have our username, we have our password. In this command here, password is taken from standard input, which is coming from here. So this basically gives us the password, which is then passed on as a password to docker login. And then we have a third parameter here, and this is an interesting part. If we go back to our Jenkins file and the docker login part here, you see that we have the username and password from standard input. We're reading it from here, but we don't have the third parameter. So the third parameter is actually the Docker registry or Docker repository URL. So this is our ECR registry URL without the application name, without Java Maven app, just the URL. And the reason why we don't have that here is that the Docker Hub server is actually the default Docker registry URL. So we don't have to provide it because it's taken as a default. But for all the other registries, if you're using Nexus Docker Registry or AWS ECR, you have to provide the server right here. So it is this command right here is actually equivalent to docker.io, which is the server URL for Docker Hub registries. So we're gonna need that one as well. So as I said, we have our login credentials, we have the username and password for the ECR repository. So now let's go to Jenkins and actually create the credential. Let's make it a global credential like Docker Hub, and let's call it ECR credentials. The username, as you saw, is AWS, and the password is right here because we executed AWS ECR get login password command. So I'm going to paste in the whole string in password field, and that gives us the ECR registry credentials. Great. So we have credentials ready to be used for build and push image commands. However, as I mentioned, we are also pulling this image into the Kubernetes cluster when we're deploying it. So we need a secret that holds these credentials as well. So right now, if I do kubectl secret, I have my registry key, which is the registry secret for Docker Hub. This is the secret type, which is docker config JSON actually. So we're going to create one for the AWS ECR. And let's use a kubectl command to create a registry secret, which is the same exact command as when creating the my registry key secret. So we have kubectl create secret, and then we have the name of the secret, which is AWS registry key. And then we have the Docker server, which is going to be the repository URL that we can find in ECR right here. And I have pasted it as a value here. Docker username is also what we saw. It's AWS. And finally, we can set Docker password, which we already have by executing this command here. So I'm gonna copy that and set as a value. Great, so now with these options, we are going to create the secret, and this secret will be used in deployment configuration file to fetch the image. So let's copy this secret name and go back to our project, and in the deployment.yaml, the image pool secrets name is going to be AWS registry key. Great. Now it's actually time to make changes in Jenkins file so that we're pushing to ECR instead of Docker Hub. So in this block right here, first of all, we need to change credentials ID, and we called it ECR credentials. And from these credentials, we're getting the username and password. So let's look at the first line, Docker build, and we're tagging the image with repository name. Now this repository URL isn't valid anymore. So let's actually remove that and set it to the ECR repository URL. We can easily grab that from the repository itself. So if you go to the list view of your repository, you have the URI and you can just copy it from here. And that is our repository URL. So repository name, the repository server name, and the repository name itself. Now, this is actually a URL we're going to need in a couple of places. We're going to need it to push the image as well, and also in the deployment file, right? It's hard-coded now. So what we're going to do is we're going to extract this whole string into a variable. So I'm going to cut that out. And because we want it to be available for all the stages and we want to set it once, we can actually do it in environment block above the stages. So let's create environment block here. And let's actually call it a repository name or Docker repo. So if we need to change that later, we only need to change it in one place and it has a generic name. So now we can use that variable instead of hard-coded value. And we can replace this part as well. Great. So now if we later change the Docker repository URL, we don't have to change it in all different places. And the last place is here. So let's actually change it in here as well. Docker repo. So again, just like these other variables, the Docker repo variable will also be replaced by environmental variable with the same name. So that's out of the way. Now let's look at the Docker logging command. We have the user of ECR credentials. We have the password that we're passing in from the standard input, but we need this third parameter, which we saw in the cheat sheets, which is the server of the repository, right? It's not the full repository URL. It doesn't have Java Maven app attached. It is basically the server only. So again, not to repeat the whole string here, so not to have this one just hard-coded, let's make this one into its own variable, and let's call it Docker repo server. And we can use it here as a variable, like this. So we have the repository server separately, and then we have the repository URL as a complete string. So let's take this variable right here, and we're gonna pass it on as a third parameter. So we have the username, password, and server without the option flag. And our Jenkins file also looks pretty generic. We can substitute values for repository, image name, etc. if we wanted to, which is obviously a more efficient way to write code. Great, so to summarize, we have basically created a repository, ECR Docker container registry on AWS, and we're using that one to push our images to and also to deploy them to Kubernetes cluster. And the changes we have made to substitute the Docker Hub registry with the AWS ECR registry are creating own credentials for ECR, adding this third parameter here, which is the repository server itself, and also creating its own secret for AWS ECR registry credentials. So with these changes, we can actually now execute the pipeline and see how this will work. So I'm going to commit the changes. Let's check the version that we are going to be incrementing. So now let's go back to Jenkins. But before we run the build for the Jenkins job branch, let's also check that nothing is running in the cluster yet. Okay, awesome. It's completely empty. There are no pods running. So let's now run the build in Jenkins. And there you go. All the stages got completed successfully. Now first, let's check our repository. We're supposed to see a new image appear here. So there you go. We have an increment of version. So this is the image tag inside the repository. And now let's go and check the cluster. And here you see the new pods are running. And now if we do kubectl describe pod and scroll up to the image, you see the image URL, which comes from ECR. So this is how you can use Amazon's own container registry in a pipeline with EKS. This is nothing specific to AWS, though this is pretty standard Docker repository usage, since we didn't have to make lots of changes here to replace the Docker Hub repository. And also note that there are other plugins for Jenkins for using AWS services, especially if you're using multiple AWS services. They integrate well with each other, so it makes things a little bit easier. So that means that there are other alternative ways of deploying from ECR to Kubernetes cluster, which is running on EKS. But this is just one way, and this basically shows you a straightforward, very easy, intuitive way of setting this whole thing up and actually understanding what's going on in the background.